Welcome back to Turning Hard Times into Good Times. I am delighted to have with me once again James Perloff. James is a prolific writer whose latest book is the topic of a monthly discussion on this show. You can go to jamesperloff.com to buy his books. The one that we want to talk to James about this month and every month, for the next several months at least, is Truth is a Lonely Warrior. And I would really encourage you to listen to the first two discussions that we've had with James Perloff, and of course encourage you to buy the book because we can only cover a portion of the material, even though we are having extensive discussions on Truth is a Lonely Warrior. There's so much material there that's so worthwhile understanding and getting into. The first discussion that we had, Chapter 1, was titled Six Wars, and Chapter 2 was titled The Powers That Be. We had that discussion several months back. I think it was in March. What we learned from our first discussions was that the last six major wars, false flags were instituted in order to get the American people to support those wars. False flags were set up which invited our perceived enemies to wage war against the United States. So, for example, Roosevelt set up our Navy in harm's way of the Japanese to ensure that they would hit our ships at Pearl Harbor. And once Americans felt that we were attacked by the Japanese, they were willing to go into war. In fact, up to that point in time, as I recall reading, only about 10% or less than 10% of the American public wanted us to get involved in the war, the Second World War. But in fact, afterwards, it was overwhelming support for America's involvement once we were struck. Well, that was just one example. James discussed false flags to get American support for the Spanish-American War, World War I, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, and most recently the Iraq War in 2003. In Chapter 2, James outlined who the ruling elite are who engineered these false flags to con the American people into supporting all of these wars. A discussion of Chapters 1 and 2 is available at J. Taylor Media. At that website. You can also go back to Voice America at my page at Voice America Business Channel to listen to those archive sites, those archive podcasts as well. On April 7th show, we began discussion of Chapter 3, titled The Devil as Banker, and Chapter 4, How the Cartel Has Run America. But given the importance of those two chapters, and I just felt that we didn't adequately cover them, we didn't spend enough time in covering them as we should have, James and I devoted May 5th, that show, to a more thorough discussion of those two chapters once again. Chapters 3 and 4 identified the powers behind the throne. In other words, it puts names to major banking families that are waging war against the very common people that the Declaration of Independence, the U.S. Constitution, is intended to protect. Chapters 3 and 4, I believe, are very important because they go to the very heart of our ongoing loss of freedom and the ongoing trend towards enslavement of the masses. The ruling elite and the organizations that fund the elite, which in essence offers bribes to scholars to define truth as the elite wish to shape it, well, they operate out of view of most of the public. I would say virtually all of the public, but they use the major media and think tanks which they fund for their own propaganda purposes. Since we are still free, at least for now, to examine their activities objectively on the Internet, I have chosen to do so, as have many other guests. James Perloff is joining me today, and many other guests on my radio show as well. Not the least, I would say, though, James Perloff, probably as much as anyone, we have really delved into details of what is in recent American history and how that has impacted our lives today. Truth is a Lonely Warrior. Today we want to talk about Chapter 5. It's titled Vietnam, and then Chapter 6 is titled The Plan Today. If Vietnam had actually put an end to America's evil foreign policy by putting Americans, to putting us back in sync with the Constitution, James would have had probably had no reason to write Truth is a Lonely Warrior. But now, that in fact has not been the case, unfortunately. I hope to explore with James now how the mainstream characterization of Vietnam actually was really a hoax, and how our country is continuing to engage in one Vietnam kind of a war after another, and why that is important to your future and mine. Thank you very much, James, for joining me again.
Jay, the thanks are all mine.
It's really good to have you with me because your book, Truth is a Lonely Warrior is a must-read, I think, if for anybody that really cares about our country and cares to know what the truth is. Can you talk a little bit about the history of Vietnam for the United States? You know, how the United States got involved in it, what pretenses were used to get us into that war?
Well, the history of Vietnam really goes back to World War II. Actually, you could say, since we're talking about the fight against communism, you could say it went back to the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917 and the funding of that by Western bankers such as the Warburgs and the Rothschilds and Kuhn Loeb. But World War II, the United States was fighting a two-front war in Asia and in Europe, and our ally, a term I use guardedly, the Soviet Union, was fighting a one-front war against Germany. And at the Tehran and Yalta conferences, the big three conferences, 1943, 1945, President Roosevelt asked Joseph Stalin, the dictator of the Soviet Union, if he would join the Pacific War and fight Japan. And Stalin said he would do that, but only on the condition that America supply him with all the equipment he'd need, all the vehicles and all the weapons. And so Roosevelt agreed, and we sent 600 shiploads of Lend-Lease supplies and munitions to Stalin, specifically, expressly for the purpose of fighting Japan. Mm-hmm. But Stalin was very clever. He waited until Japan was beaten. He didn't enter the Asian War until 5 days before Japan surrendered. The atomic bomb had already pounded Hiroshima. Mm-hmm. So he was able to go in, and he brought his American Lend-Lease supplies, and as well as the Japanese munitions, which he was allowed to accept the surrender of in China. He turned them over to Mao Zedong, mm-hmm. and that led in turn to the communizing of the entire country of China mm-hmm. by 1949. And of course, we also gave Stalin control of North Korea on the pretext that he was our ally, helping win the Pacific War. It would thus enabling the Korean War. Completely unnecessary, totally artificial. But Vietnam was next on the spots of communist expansion.
Mm-hmm. All right, so that's a little history there. It seems to me that in fact, I guess geopolitics gets very complicated, which is probably one of the reasons that Washington suggested we never get involved in foreign involvements. But President Washington, that is, you cite evidence that there was a secret deal between President Roosevelt, and I guess basically you just covered that then in 1942 regarding Vietnam. I guess you just mentioned that then. That was in 1942, right?
Well, 1943, the Tehran conference, Stalin said that he was denouncing France, saying there were a bunch of collaborationists, and he said they should not get Indochina back, which would include Vietnam and Cambodia and Laos, after the war. Indochina, of course, had been a French colony, had been mm-hmm. colonized by them, and Roosevelt said he was 100% in agreement, and so it became the policy of our government and the policy of the Department of State to pressure France to leave Indochina. That pressure only let up during the Korean War, but when the Korean War ended in 1953, full force we went again, pushing the French to leave Vietnam.
Mm-hmm. But we really, it seems as though somewhere back there then we started to really actually support Ho Chi Minh, which of course was the enemy during the Vietnam War. How did that come about?
Well, that's quite an interesting bit of history. In 1945, we were supporting Ho Chi Minh. In 1945, we sent the OSS into Vietnam, and on my website, jamesperloff.com, we have a blog post extensive on the war in Vietnam, and the background to it, and I have a photo there showing beaming American OSS officers with General Giap, who later would slaughter American troops, and beaming Ho Chi Minh, and they were training and arming Ho Chi Minh's forces. Now, the public pretext was it was to fight Japan, but in the summer of 1945, Japan was already beaten. There was no need to train and arm a communist army in North Vietnam, but that's what we did, and the real purpose was to drive out the French, and of course, just as Stalin's troops were allowed to accept the surrender of Japanese munitions in China, Ho Chi Minh was given those surrendered Japanese munitions in Indochina, which he then used to fight the French.
And, I understand that basically our news media really sort of worshipped Ho Chi Minh. They compared him to George Washington even. Do you have any idea why America, which supposedly, it just seems so contradictory to the notion of what America is supposed to be about, at least what our Constitution said we were about, that you would support a dictator like that. And how could they see a Ho Chi Minh as a George Washington?
Well, it was Harold Isaacs of Newsweek who called him that. But this is a pattern that has repeated itself throughout history. If you go back to the days when the nationalists and the communists were fighting in China, the late 1940s, Mao Zedong was portrayed as what they called an agrarian reformer. It was denied that he was communist. And a great book on that is While You Slept by John T. Flynn. He talks about the media coverage. But if you take it up to Castro in Cuba,
I was going to say, 1950s,
yes. Harold Matthews of the New York Times had these front page pieces describing him as a great Democrat. And Ed Sullivan, you can see the clip on YouTube of Ed Sullivan saying what a fine young man he is. He's the George Washington of Cuba, and then he had Soviet missiles pointed at us 3 years later. But they did this with Harold Isaacs of Newsweek met with Ho Chi Minh. He was described as a great Democrat, but we've been doing this throughout our history. It's part of a continuing pattern, and one that, unfortunately, without an alternative media like yours to turn to, people had no way of catching on to the truth.
I think it's continuing. I think we talked to Daniel McAdams of the Ron Paul Institute for Peace and Prosperity and get the same sort of rhyme and rhythm going on here. But I remember very clearly, James, as a sixth grader hearing my sixth grade teacher, Mr. Kirchhoffer, talking about exactly in those terms. He probably was reading the very same media that suggested that Castro was a fine person, was going to really turn things out better for the people. I mean, it wasn't as if Batista, the previous leader, was anything to really be praiseworthy for. Certainly. But then when you think about it, you and I have just been talking about this for the last couple of months or so, what's going on in American foreign policy. But it seems as though we're constantly getting involved, many times unseating elected governments and putting in rough dictators that are against the people, but somehow provide some, I guess, large corporate interests perhaps to reign over various countries. But anyway, getting back to Vietnam, in 1954, Ho Chi Minh's forces they surrounded, hemmed in the French troops, and as I understand it from your book, the French were looking to America for some help to help protect them, but we weren't too concerned about that. We weren't too concerned about the French, where we were. Can you explain that bit of history to us? You might have just touched on it a moment ago, I guess, perhaps, but go ahead.
Oh, well, what I was specifically referring to in that context was Dien Bien Phu. That was where they had the decisive battle for the French in Indochina, and they were surrounded by General Giap's troops, and were getting pounded. And it was largely a battle of attrition. The communists had heavy artillery that most of which they'd gotten from Mao Zedong in China, and the French asked the United States if we would just make a 2-hour aircraft carrier strike, and that would have taken out the artillery and could have saved them at Dien Bien Phu, and the United States refused.
All right. Well, I mean, why?
Well, because as we said earlier, it had been our policy since the Tehran Conference to have the French leave Indochina. I should mention, this is interesting, Hilaire de Berryer, who was in the OSS and became an intelligence specialist for the public. He had his own newsletter out of Monaco from 1958 to 2001. He pointed out that all the State Department people who were working on the Indochina desk after France left Indochina, they were transferred to the Algeria desk and started pressuring France to leave Algeria, because part of this whole international oligarchy's plan was to reduce countries like Spain and France and England from empires and reduce them essentially to provinces of the European Union, because we're really looking at a long-term plan unfolding. But this was certainly part of it, was to weaken the nations of Europe by disconnecting them from their colonies.
That's very interesting. When was Vietnam divided north and south?
Well, this is another bad portent when you divide a country. That was the Geneva Conference of 1954. And they were dividing it as much as they had Korea, which then, of course, led to the Korean War. And North Vietnam was given to Ho Chi Minh and the Communists, and the South was very briefly given to Emperor Bao Dai. And the idea was that both sides would hold elections, and of course the Communists never held elections, and Bao Dai was compelled to give the South over to Ngo Dinh Diem, who held a rigged election.
Yeah, Diem, I remember the name, of course, as a young man during Vietnam, the early days of Vietnam. So the U.S. refused to help France, and so I guess that then paved the way for the U.S. to sneak in there, huh?
Well, without the French as a bastion against communism, the public pretext was, of course, to stop the dominoes from falling.
Yes.
The problem was that in point of fact, despite their public pronouncements, our leaders were not interested in a victorious battle against communism.
Well, it would seem so. I mean, we were just honky-dory with Ho Chi Minh and seemingly Mao Zedong and Stalin. I mean, these were not we, the people, but certainly the people that run our country, the powers behind the throne were, right?
Well, later on, we'll cover a later chapter where I talk about this unpublicized alliance that's occurred for many decades between capitalists and communists. David Rockefeller had, during the Cold War, his jet had private landing rights in Moscow. It's true. Just read Joseph Finder's book, Red Carpet, about all the aid that poured into the Soviet Union. And, of course, Zbigniew Brzezinski back in 1961 was publishing articles in Foreign Affairs, the Journal of the Council on Foreign Relations, calling for increased trade with the Soviet bloc, which, of course, then turned that trade into weapons and munitions and goods for North Vietnam during our war.
That's incredible. So Rockefeller could just take his private jet and fly into Moscow anytime he wanted, huh?
Well, yeah. In fact, some people say it was interesting that after he flew there in '64, shortly after that, Khrushchev was deposed, and a lot of people think that Rockefeller gave the order. Can't be proven.
Yeah, that's incredible. Well, I guess, if you have the money, you have the power, probably. Can you talk a little bit, speaking of the Council of Foreign Relations, which was, heavily dominated by David Rockefeller and those folks, can you talk about the role of the CIA and the Council of Foreign Relations activist Colonel Edward Lansdale? Talk about the role that he played in aiding and abetting the communists in Vietnam and putting in power corrupt leaders in Vietnam, then going on forward through the time. I think you mentioned Diem. Was Diem put in there by these guys?
Mm-hmm. That's right. Diem was living in America in the early 1950s, and he became the darling of the Rockefellers. They gave him a luncheon at their estate, and he gave a speech at the Council on Foreign Relations. And you have to say that after removing the French and dividing the country, our next step was to get rid of the emperor, which is Bao Dai. And this is actually very significant because a lot of Americans don't get this. We've been schooled to hate monarchies and think
Yes.
how bad they are. But actually, monarchies are inherently unifying because a monarch is to be loyal to his entire people. When we replace that, whether it's with a communist revolution or what we call democracy, and our American diplomacy would demand democracy. Democracy tends to be inherently divisive because it divides a country into different parties.
Sure.
In this case, we insisted that Bao Dai step down, and here's what he said. I'll give you a direct quote. He said, quote, "If your country had given me 1/1000th of the sum they spent to depose me, I could have won that war," unquote, meaning the Vietnam War. The people would have rallied around them, and instead we insisted that they in South Vietnam accept Ngo Dinh Diem as their president. There was a rigged election. He claimed 98% of the people voted for him, but they hated him. He's from the North, not the South. He was a Catholic, whereas most of the population was Buddhist.
Yes.
But he was very oppressive. And Lansdale, you're asking about Lansdale was with CIA and Council on Foreign Relations, and he wanted to consolidate Ngo Dinh Diem's power. And there were these indigenous groups in Vietnam which were very anti-communist. This included some religious sects, the Cao Dai sect and the Hoa Hao sect. And there was also a virtual warlord named Le Vien Vien. He had a private army, and these guys would wipe out the communists whenever they went up against them, but they were all disarmed under the supervision of Lansdale, using the South Vietnamese army of Ngo Dinh Diem. So we actually neutralized the anti-communist forces that were indigenous in South Vietnam, and then Diem's own army turned on him, deposed him, and assassinated him. So he just created a complete vacuum into which the communist forces of Ho Chi Minh then invaded into the South.
Boy, it just sounds so reminiscent of what's going on more recently in the Middle East. But, I remember so clearly now as a young man, I remember seeing, news reports of these Buddhists burning themselves alive in protest against Diem. So, I mean, it was really an outside power and forces that went into Vietnam and forced against the will of the people a foreign power, it just seems so evil. It's just horrible. I don't know. It's just the whole story, as I say, just seems so reminiscent of what's going on now in the Middle East. And the more we get involved in, the more chaotic the political and economic landscape gets in the Middle East. But it seems like almost the design is to create chaos. And from chaos, then I guess you can hope, they hope to gain control. Is that the modus operandi?
Well, it certainly is. It's the exact opposite of what George Washington warned against. He said you should have a non-interventionist, avoid foreign entanglements, but we have been imposing our will, or I should say the elitist oligarchy that controls American foreign policy has been imposing its will on foreign countries to restructure the world, with our ultimate intention, of course, being world government.
And again, you mentioned in your book that, it didn't take long to come out the victors in World War II. I mean, some argue that we didn't even need to use the nuclear war to do that, the nuclear bomb. We were, in fact, had the war won, but in fact that was a statement for the United States to let everybody know who was in charge after that. But you point out in your book that it took 14 years. We were in Vietnam 14 years, and we'd have been there a lot longer if there wasn't an uprising, I suppose. But can you talk about a few of the strategic omissions that kept us really? I mean, it seems as though the hands were tied behind the back. I mean, if you're in a war, go in it to win it, you would think, right? But I'm thinking a very interesting remark and information that you had there about the Ho Chi Minh Trail and how, in fact, our military people were not really allowed to come out as victors there.
Oh, well, we fought this war completely differently. Korea and Vietnam were not like other wars we had fought. In World War II, we fought to win. But in Vietnam, we were fighting under completely different conditions. The Ho Chi Minh Trail, the pilots were under restriction. You couldn't bomb anything more than 200 yards off the trail. And of course, that's ridiculous. The Viet Cong, the Vietnamese trucks would simply pull off the trail. They'd be forewarned by radar that the planes were coming, and then just get back on the trail. And it's interesting, there was an author named Lloyd Mallon. And in 1968, he interviewed a dozen retired, high-ranking U.S. military officers. They all agreed the Vietnam War could be won in weeks or months at the most. We had the power to do that. Specifically regarding the Ho Chi Minh Trail, they said those bombings are not going to stop the flow of supplies to the Viet Cong in the south. You need to block it. Just put Marines on the mountain passes overlooking the trail. That would stop it. But none such sensible advice was followed by Washington.
I mean, why? I mean, it just seems so insane. Either unless again, there's a bigger picture here. I guess it's about control, and I guess it's about trying to gain dominance. But you would think by winning a war, you would then have control. Help me understand what the reasoning is behind this ruling elite. Why would they not want to win a war?
Well, Jay, the answer to that, I think, is to understand that the objectives of a war sometimes are not contained within the country in which the war is being fought. For example, in Korea, you had these bloody battles for possession of a hill with a control passing back and forth between the Allied forces and the Communist forces. But the ruling elite were not interested in who won what hill. They were interested in using the Korean War to validate the United Nations, whose peacekeeping credentials and abilities had been called into question by patriotic American Congress. That was the purpose of the war, as well as bypassing the Constitution. And that was the first war we fought without a declaration of war, of course. Harry Truman didn't even bother to consult the Congress because we're now part of the UN, and we're now suffering the the effects of being under its mandate instead of our Constitution. But in Vietnam, I think, again, the objectives primarily lay outside of Vietnam, and I think they were primarily dragging out this war, to create changes here at home. And again, we defeated the Japanese and the Germans in just 3.5 years, two very powerful military empires. We can't beat little North Vietnam in 14 years. That doesn't make sense. If you look at the restrictions, we couldn't bomb a surface-to-air missile launch site until it was fully operational. We couldn't bomb a fighter plane, a MiG, if it was on the ground. That's not how we fought in World War II. World War II, if you saw something on the ground, you fired at it.
Yeah,
if we fought World War II like in Vietnam, we would have lost World War II. It's two completely different methodologies.
I mean, the old saying is all is fair in love and war. But this war apparently, again, it's something called the Rules of Engagement that was passed by, was it the U.S. Congress that passed that, or was it the Johnson administration that imposed that on our military efforts there?
Oh, no, Congress was not even aware of it. It wasn't made public until 1985, I believe it was, when Barry Goldwater published them, took up 26 pages in the Congressional Record.
Wow. So, I mean, can you talk a little bit about the prosecution? Again, Defense Secretary, we had all these people that were in the government that seemed to be so much in favor of the enemy to a great extent. I mean, there was Robert McNamara, of course. He was the Secretary of Defense during the Rules of Engagement. I guess that was his deal. That's what that it wasn't the Congress. It was Robert McNamara, the Secretary of Defense. There was an amazing quote also from a book written by Walter Rostow, who advised President Kennedy to commit troops into Vietnam in 1961. I'm wondering if you could share that quote from Rostow, perhaps. I think it reveals the hidden agenda, perhaps. Maybe this is sort of getting to what this seemingly ridiculous behavior is all about. But page 63 and 64 of your book, there's a quote there. Would you care to pass that along to our listeners?
Yeah, Rostow wrote this in 1960, which is 1 year before he gave the advice to President Kennedy to send troops to Vietnam, which was actually the initiation of large numbers of American troops in Vietnam. But he said this, quote, "It is a legitimate American national objective to see removed from all nations, including the United States, the right to use substantial military force to pursue their own interests. Since this right is the root of national sovereignty, it is therefore an American interest to see an end to nationhood as it has been historically defined," unquote. Well, Rostow, now that very much embodies the viewpoint of the Council on Foreign Relations,
of course,
as a member. But the reason I wanted to bring this up is that Rostow, for advising Johnson and Kennedy on Vietnam, he was called a hawk. What I'm trying to point out here, he was not an Archie Bunker. I was a hippie back then. We were supposed to believe that the guys behind the wall were these Archie Bunker, flag-waving, patriotic. He was not patriotic. Right. And nor was he anti-communist. His father had been a Marxist revolutionary in Russia. Two of his aunts belonged to the U.S. Communist Party. And his brother was Eugene Debs Rostow, named for the Socialist Party leader.
Wow.
So this guy's not resonating with anti-communism, but he's the one who told Kennedy to send troops to Vietnam.
Yeah, and then he was labeled as a hawk. In fact, it was exactly the opposite. And prosecuting a war with your hands tied behind your back, Secretary McNamara. Also, William P. Bundy, Assistant Secretary of State for the Far East, played. You talk a little bit about his role that he played in escalating the Vietnam War, in his love of the communist ideology as well. I mean, it just seems like there's so many of these guys. But you did have something. Would you care to comment just briefly on Bundy and his views?
Bundy was important to the conversation because he was the one who drafted the Tonkin Gulf Resolution. And he drafted it before the Tonkin Gulf incident took place. So you know that they were simply, everybody today knows, of course, that the Tonkin Gulf incident did not happen. I quote Congressional Medal of Honor winner James Stockdale, who was a pilot in the Tonkin Gulf, on that in my book. But you can even go onto YouTube, see the guys on the destroyers who admit that there were no attacks. But he was the one who drafted the Tonkin Gulf Resolution, Bundy, and he was skull and bones, Council on Foreign Relations, Committee of 300, and after he left the Defense Department, he was appointed the editor of Foreign Affairs by David Rockefeller. Foreign Affairs, the journal of the Council on Foreign Relations, opposing American sovereignty. But as far as his his views on communism, you go back to the 1950s, he was the head of the Alger Hiss Defense Fund. Alger
Wow.
Hiss, of course, notorious Soviet spy, and so obviously, if you're an anti-communist, you don't go about defending Soviet agents and spies. So again, like Rostow, the complete contradiction, portrayed as a hawk in the media, the reality was something different.
Yeah, so the Tonkin incident, of course, was the false flag that helped to get us draw in the public support of Vietnam, which was a complete hoax. During the 1964 presidential election, I remember it very clearly, James. I remember the ad that had the little girl picking daisies and a mushroom cloud going off in the back, a nuclear bomb, and the implication was if you reelect Barry Goldwater, he's going to bring us to World War III, and it will all be over for us. In fact, it turns out that Johnson was a major hawk as soon as he won that election, right? Could you comment on that, and then we have to take a commercial break?
Yeah, you can still see that commercial on this on YouTube. But yeah, he started escalating the war immediately afterwards. And what people don't know is that he did not want to escalate the war. Again, it's the hidden hand. He was told to escalate the war by a secret clique of advisors that were not known about by the Congress of the People, nicknamed the Wise Men, included Dean Acheson, John J. McCloy, Robert Levitt, Averell Harriman, who were advising him to escalate the war. Then in 1968, they did an abrupt turnaround, told him the war was a mistake. They left him holding the bag, and it was his shock at that withdrawal of their support, of the elite support, that caused him to announce he would not run for re-election in the elections of '68.
All right. Well, I think we've covered a lot of the high points in the first chapter. Chapter 5 is titled Vietnam, in The Truth is a Lonely Warrior. We do have to go to commercial break. When we come back, I want to talk about Chapter 6, or I should say ask you to talk about Chapter 6, titled The Plan Today, because we want to be able to tie in all of this history with what is going on right now. So don't go away, folks. We'll be right back with James Perloff after the break. Welcome back to Turning Hard Times into Good Times. I'm your host, Jay Taylor, and I'm really pleased to have with me James Perloff. He's back again to discuss his book, Truth is a Lonely Warrior, and in particular we want to talk about Chapter 6, titled The Plan Today. We just talked about Vietnam, and what we want to learn from Vietnam, we focused on Vietnam because that is probably the war that most of us older guys at least remember most vividly, and that was one in which there was a major anti-war activity that sort of pushed us out of there sooner than some people would have liked. So what we want to do is try to apply and make some sense of these wars and what it means today and where we're going today in the economy, and primarily in the economy, but it certainly has implications as well for our liberties and for justice for all of the people. But in any event, James, in Chapter 6, you talked about exporting our economy. Can you talk about how institutions like GATT, NAFTA, FTAA, and how they've been used essentially to destroy rather than to enhance American prosperity?
Well, I was covering the GATT treaty in 1994 for a national magazine, and that was what got us into the World Trade Organization. And it's these trade treaties, Jay, that have caused the death of American manufacturing. When they were debating the GATT treaty in Congress, they said, don't worry, we're just going to export-import both. But the trade deficit the year after we passed the GATT treaty shot from 75 to 103 billion. By 2007, it was up to 700 billion, our trade deficit. And so the biggest thing we're exporting is jobs. And let me just comment on why these treaties resulted in that. When we passed the GATT treaty, the European Union was given 30 votes in the World Trade Organization. Africa was given 35 votes, and America was given 1 vote. So
wow.
we're forced to abide by regulations that other countries set. And what these treaties did was to tear apart our tariff structure and the quota structure that had protected what remained of American industry. I remember when I went to college, there were here in New England, there were a lot of shoe manufacturers, textile manufacturers. The textile industry was wiped out. Our electronics industry wiped out. Our steel industry largely destroyed. what these treaties did was to bring in a tidal wave of cheap imports. And I just want to comment. I have a appendix. I don't know if you read it or not in the book. It's called "The Myths of Free Trade." But the idea of free trade in of itself, if you've got two free countries, to have free trade is a good idea. But what's happened is that the old argument was that in America you'd have a manufacturer made a product, say it's sweater, for $25, and then some guy in Scotland who came up with a better manufacturing, more efficient manufacturing process could make the same sweater for $20, and the American manufacturer would then ask Congress for a tariff, and he'd get a $10 tariff put on the Scotsman's goods. And this would seem bad because it raises prices for consumers, and it punishes the Scotsman's ingenuity and protects the Americans' laziness. That's the free trade argument, but the problem is that it does not incorporate the reality of what's going on today. Goods are not made cheap just by ingenuity and efficiency in manufacturing. They're also made cheap by slave labor. And so you've got these American companies that have gone overseas and employing Chinese workers that work all day for 60 cents an hour, or sometimes foreign socialist countries will undercut the American manufacturer by subsidizing their goods, and you can't expect American companies to compete with slave labor or foreign government subsidies. So you do need to protect our industries. The Founding Fathers were avid protectionists, and it was the protectionism of this country that actually, even though it's become a dirty word, many conservatives have just not got the difference between efficiency and the types of principles that existed in the world of Adam Smith when he wrote his volume many years ago, and the conditions that exist today. It's very different, but it was those trade treaties that destroyed and exported our economy.
Well, it certainly seems, that you wouldn't need to have something so complex as these treaties, and they're secret in nature. You could just simply reduce tariffs. Both countries agree to reduce tariffs, and that would be one way to get free trade. I think that would be a lot simpler. But speaking of agreements that are done in secret, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which I understand is being railroaded through by Obama now, only some of the sort of the labor-orientated legislators are against it from the Democratic side. But it's my understanding, James, that senators are not even allowed to know what's in the thing. They have to vote for it. They are allowed to go and read it, but they're not allowed to take any notes. They're not allowed to take any of their assistants in to read the documents. They're not allowed to talk about what's in the documents to their constituency. As Nancy Pelosi said with regard to Obamacare, we need to pass it so that we know what's in it. How ludicrous is that? And what in the world is going on in our country? It just all sort of it doesn't make any sense until you start to believe that there's something bigger going on here than the concerns and cares for America among our leaders. But Trans-Pacific Partnership, that's another example, right?
Yes, and who would sign a contract if they weren't allowed to read it? You'd immediately, if somebody said, I want you to sign this, but you can't read it, you'd say, wait a minute, I'm not going to sign that. So it's absurd for Congress to pass it without reading it, but you can be sure that this is the same thing I saw in '94. It's the same mix of liberals and conservatives on both sides. You've got, in the case of the GATT treaty, you had liberal Democrats and conservative Republicans opposing it and favoring it. It's the same thing now. You've got Obama favoring it, but you've got Elizabeth Warren from my state as a big liberal against it, and you've got conservative Republicans in favor of it, but you've got Pat Buchanan against it, and the confusion, again, is over this principle of free trade, really outdated and not recognizing the conditions that in our world today. But one of the real problems with something like the TPP is that, number one, it's not worked out by our legislators. It's worked out by these multinational corporations. And also, whenever you pass one of these things, our laws, under the Constitution, a treaty becomes a supreme law of the land.
Right.
And our laws become subservient to the regulations of the TPP, which we don't know what it says. But, for example, food safety, product safety, things like that, which are governed by our laws, those laws can now be overruled by the regulations that we haven't even read yet.
Oh, absolutely. It's just totally insane. Well, we just have a couple of minutes left here yet, James, but can you talk a little bit about the war on terror? Since 9/11, an increasing war on terror. How does that fit into the scheme of the Council of Foreign Relations and the move towards a one-world government?
Well, I should mention, that just to segue from trade, NAFTA was intended to be turned into a North American Union exactly as the common market was turned into the European Union. In fact, let me just quote Andrew Redding of the World Policy Institute. He said, quote, NAFTA signals the formation of a new political unit, North America. With economic integration will come political integration. Following the lead of the Europeans, North Americans should begin considering formation of a continental parliament, unquote. That's where they're headed with this. They want a North American Union. But the war on terror, Robert Pastor is considered the father of the North American Union. And here's what he said in the CFR's Journal of Foreign Affairs regarding the war on terror. Okay, he said, quote, security fears would serve as a catalyst for deeper integration. That would require new structures to assure mutual security. The Department of Homeland Security should expand its mission to include continental security, a shift best achieved by incorporating Mexican and Canadian personnel into its design and operation, unquote, Robert Pastor. So you see what they're trying to do is to take the war on terror and incorporate that along with the trade agreement with our NAFTA partners into this ultimate goal of a North American Union, which is only a stepping stone towards world government, because as Zbigniew Brzezinski put it, quote, we cannot leap into world government in one quick step. The precondition for genuine globalization is progressive regionalization, unquote. In other words, you won't get people to form a union with Europe yet, or world government, but you can get them to have a stepping stone, a regional alliance, just like the EU is a regional alliance on the European continent, and eventually you use these stepping stones to get their ultimate goal of a world government, which I can assure you would be a world tyranny, because you would have all power concentrated in a single government.
Yeah, well, there's no question about it. And the Trans-Pacific Partnership is, of course, it's really encompassing countries from 3 continents, I believe. I mean, you've got Asian countries involved, you've got South American countries involved, and you've got Canada, America, and Mexico, the NAFTA countries. I don't know if there are European countries in that, or I don't think so. But in any event, it's to try to hold off China for now, I think, to neutralize China in this battle for a one world government, I guess. I really, there's so much more to talk about, always to talk about. One of the major concerns I'd like to get your opinion on, we don't have time today, but sometime in the near future, what's going on with the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the BRICS on the one hand, seemingly competing against the petrodollar, the Anglo-American empire, but on the other hand, you know, we see how the United States and how under the surface, we just talked about it today in the case of Vietnam, how our leaders were making friends with the communists who we later then were supposedly at war with, but not really at war with. So I wonder, James, is to what extent the games are being played now under the table with the Chinese, with the Russians, with the BRIC countries, unbeknownst to us, so that somehow a one world government can be formed, or at least that would be the goals of these people. And maybe we can pick up on that. Could we talk about that sometime in the future, perhaps?
I would love to, because that's where we're headed.
Yeah, it's very important stuff. Well, James, we are out of time. I want to thank you very much for joining me again. We'll look to do it on the first Tuesday of next month. So that would be the first Tuesday of July. Thank you very much for being with me again.